Welcome to Albert the Sleepy Historian. Here, history isn't just about dates, it's about stories. On this channel, we'll journey through the Middle Ages and beyond, uncovering the lives of kings, knights, and ordinary folk who shaped the world. So sit back, relax, and let's begin our journey into the past. In the medieval world, the great castles and soaring cathedrals often capture the imagination. Yet it was not the lords and kings who made up the majority of society, but the countless poor peasants whose daily lives unfolded in modest homes scattered across the countryside. Their housing and living conditions speak to a world both harsh and resilient, woven together with poverty, labour, and community. Let us step into the shoes of a traveller wandering the muddy lanes of a medieval village. Smoke curls lazily into the sky from thatched rooftops. Children chase a skinny chicken through the dirt, their laughter cutting through the heavy air. You draw closer and see the cottages, small, low structures of mud, brick, or wattle and daub, patched and repaired with whatever material was at hand. These are the homes of the peasants, humble, functional, and always precarious. Essay-like explanation might tell us that peasant homes varied in size depending on wealth, region, and available resources. Most consisted of a single room where cooking, eating, and sleeping all occurred in the same space. The walls were often made of woven sticks, covered with clay and dung, a construction known as wattle and daub, though in some regions stone or mud brick was used. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds, materials vulnerable to fire and decay. Windows, if they existed, were tiny slits covered with cloth or wooden shutters, letting in little light. Now, imagine stepping through the low doorway. The interior is dim, the only light source the hearth at the centre of the room. The smoke, with no chimney to escape through, lingers and stings your eyes. The air is heavy with the scent of wood smoke, animals, and the earthy damp of straw strewn across the dirt floor. Here the family gathers, not only to cook, but to keep warm, to mend clothing, and to share what little they have. Peasant families often shared their living quarters with livestock. A goat or a few chickens might wander freely inside the cottage, providing warmth in winter and protection from thieves at night. To the modern mind, such conditions might seem unbearable, yet for the medieval peasant, they were a part of survival. The boundary between human and animal life blurred out of necessity, a mingling of bodies under one fragile roof. From an analytical perspective, the small size of peasant homes was a reflection of economic and social structures. Land was the ultimate source of wealth and power in feudal society, and most peasants had little claim to it. They lived in homes provided by the lords whose fields they farmed, often with little ability to make improvements. Repairs were temporary, and comfort was sacrificed for function. This was not a world of privacy or personal space. Families ate together, slept together, and laboured together in the same tight quarters. Listen closer, and you might hear the voices of the family gathered at the hearth. The father, weary from hours in the fields, pulls off his boots and sits at the wooden bench. The mother stirs a pot of pottage, a thin stew of vegetables, grains, and whatever scraps of meat might be found. The children sit cross-legged on the straw, waiting patiently, their stomachs grumbling. Their clothing, patched many times over, hangs loosely from thin shoulders. These scenes were repeated endlessly in villages across medieval Europe, a cycle of toil and endurance. Hygiene was minimal in these conditions. The dirt floors were rarely cleaned, and pests like fleas and lice thrived. The hearth doubled as a cooking and heating source, but it also filled the home with smoke, contributing to chronic health problems. Bathing was infrequent, and water was fetched from communal wells or streams, often shared with animals. Illness spread quickly in such cramped and unsanitary spaces. Yet the resilience of the human spirit meant that even here, in these poor homes, people found joy, laughter, and connection. Consider also the role of community. While the houses themselves were poor, peasants lived in close-knit villages where survival depended on cooperation. A neighbour might help repair a roof or share food in times of need. Children grew up surrounded not only by their immediate family, but by the entire village, learning the rhythms of agricultural life from an early age. The home, though small and humble, was part of a larger social fabric that bound peasants together. Still, the fragility of peasant housing meant that disaster was never far away. A single spark could set the thatch ablaze, reducing a family's shelter to ash within minutes. Harsh winters tested the limits of warmth and food stores. Floods and storms battered the thin walls and roofs. To be a peasant was to live always on the edge of uncertainty, with one bad harvest or natural disaster threatening survival itself. Yet let us not imagine only misery. Picture, if you will, a summer evening outside the peasant's home. The day's work is done, and the family sits in the fading light. A few goats graze nearby, chickens cluck softly, and the smell of bread baking drifts from the hearth. The laughter of children carries on the breeze. The cottage, though small and poor, is filled with life. It is here that stories are told, songs are sung, and traditions are passed down. The walls may be made of mud and straw, but within them beats the enduring heart of peasant life. From a broader perspective, these conditions remind us that medieval society was built on layers of inequality. While lords lived in stone fortresses and the church erected magnificent cathedrals, the peasants bore the weight of labour that sustained it all. Their homes, fragile and modest, stand in stark contrast to the grandeur of the elite. And yet, without these homes and the people who lived in them, medieval society could not have functioned. And so, as the fire dies low in the hearth and the night settles over the small village, we leave the humble peasant cottage behind. The smoke drifts lazily upward, the animals settle in the straw, and the family huddles together against the chill. Though their lives were marked by hardship, Their homes were filled with the rhythm of daily survival, the warmth of togetherness and the quiet dignity of endurance. In these small mud and timber houses, history was lived, not in the grandeur of castles, but in the simple stories of ordinary people. Yet that food came only through endless toil. From sunrise to sunset, peasants bent their backs to the land, turning soil, sowing seed, and harvesting under the watchful eye of the manor. The life of a medieval peasant family was bound tightly to the soil, to the rhythm of the seasons, and to the demands of survival. Work and agriculture were not simply occupations, but the very foundation of existence. From the first light of dawn to the fading glow of dusk, the peasant family lived in a cycle of toil, duty, and resilience that defined the medieval countryside. In the fields, the day began early. The rooster's crow or the tolling of a church bell would stir the family awake. For many peasants, there was no choice of career, no dream of pursuing something different. The land demanded labour, and the family supplied it. The father often took the lead in ploughing, guiding oxen or horses through heavy soil, the wooden plough biting into the earth. Behind him, sometimes his wife or older children followed, dropping seeds by hand, their fingers brushing the cool dirt as they planted barley, rye, wheat, or oats. Farming tools were primitive and slow, yet every stroke mattered, for a failed harvest could mean hunger and desperation in the cold months ahead. The work was not solely about planting or harvesting. Throughout the year, the family tended to countless tasks, repairing fences, maintaining ditches for drainage, clearing weeds that threatened to choke the crops. Women played no small role. While they might spend much of the day baking bread, churning butter, or spinning wool, they also worked in the fields during busy seasons. Children, too, from an early age, learned to scatter seed, scare away birds, or help gather the harvest. Life was communal. Everyone contributed because survival depended on it. I imagine a scene where a young boy, barefoot and tired, trudges behind his father in the spring. His small hands clutch a bag of seeds, scattering them with more enthusiasm than precision. Yet the father does not scold him. He knows the boy will learn in time, just as he himself once learned under his own father's watchful eye. The earth smells rich, and the sun climbs steadily higher, promising both hope and hardship in the season to come. Agriculture was not only labour, but obligation. Most peasants did not own the land they worked, it belonged to the lord of the manor. In return for use of a few strips of land, peasants owed rent, often paid in the form of grain, livestock, or days of labour on the lord's domain fields. These extra days, known as boon work, could be especially gruelling, as families left their own crops untended to ensure the lord's fields were ploughed or harvested first. It created tension, for a poor peasant might look at his ripening wheat with worry, knowing a storm could ruin it while he laboured elsewhere. Yet refusal was unthinkable, for the Lord's authority held firm, reinforced by custom and law. The rhythm of work followed the turning of the year. Spring brought ploughing and sowing, summer meant weeding and haymaking, autumn was harvest, and winter brought repairs, spinning and preparation for the next cycle. The harvest was both the climax and the most perilous time. Entire families worked from dawn to dusk, cutting wheat with sickles, binding sheaves, stacking them into stooks to dry. The air was filled with dust, sweat, and urgency. A poor harvest meant a hard winter, a bountiful one meant security, though never luxury. Grain was life, turned into bread, pottage, or ale, and guarded jealously against theft or spoilage. Picture the harvest season. A mother bends low, cutting stalks with practised efficiency, while her daughter gathers them into bundles. In the distance, boys laugh as they chase one another through the stubble, yet even their game ends with work as they gather stray ears of wheat left behind. The father, wiping his brow, watches the sky anxiously, hoping rain will hold off for just a few more days. In those moments, one senses the fragile thread upon which their survival rested. Beyond the fields, peasants tended to animals, pigs that foraged in the woods, sheep that grazed on common land, chickens scratching in the dirt outside cottages. Manure from animals fertilized the fields, creating a cycle of nourishment. The work never ended, for animals required feeding, milking, and care in sickness. A cow's death could be a catastrophe, while a healthy flock of sheep might mean warm clothing and a chance to trade wool for other necessities. Agricultural life also carried a social rhythm. Work was hard, but it was not always solitary. Villages often practiced open-field farming, with strips of land scattered among peasants, ensuring neighbours worked side by side. The collective labour fostered a sense of shared hardship, gossip, and companionship. Festivals and holy days punctuated the cycle, offering rare pauses where labour gave way to feasting, dancing, and prayer. Yet even these moments reminded peasants of their dependence on good harvests and divine favour. Still, for all its hardship, the work had meaning. The peasant families' labour sustained not only themselves, but the entire fabric of medieval society. Lords, knights, priests, and even kings depended on the steady toil of men and women who turned the soil and harvested its bounty. Without them, castles would not stand, armies would not march, and churches would not thrive. Their lives were humble, but their work was indispensable. Imagine the end of a long day. The family gathers in their small home, weary but together. A fire burns low, a pot of pottage simmers with whatever vegetables or scraps they have, and bread rests on the table. The father's hands are rough and cracked, the mother's shoulders ache, the children yawn with exhaustion. Yet there is also a quiet pride, for they have worked the land, kept faith with the rhythm of the seasons, and endured another day. Outside, the fields stretch into the twilight, silent witnesses to their endless labour. The work of medieval peasants was not romantic. It was demanding, uncertain, and often harsh. But it was also a testament to resilience. Through calloused hands and aching backs, through hunger and hardship, these families carved a life out of the soil. Agriculture was their burden, their duty, and their inheritance, passed from parent to child like the land itself. And though their voices rarely made it into the chronicles of kings and nobles, the story of medieval Europe was written just as much in the furrows of their fields as in the halls of power. And while their cottages of mud and thatch gave them shelter from the wind and rain, it was faith that gave them shelter from despair. Beyond the smoke-filled rooms and crowded beds, their hearts turned to the church, to prayer, and to the hope of something greater than the hardships of daily life. Let us step into the quiet world of a medieval village, where the sound of church bells drifts across the fields and the smoke of peat fires rises into the cold morning sky. For the peasant families who made up the vast majority of medieval Europe, faith was not something distant or optional. It was the very fabric of daily life. Religion shaped not only their prayers, but their time, their duties, and their hope in a world filled with hardship. The parish church stood at the heart of the village, often the strongest building for miles. Its stone walls endured when cottages crumbled, and its bell called peasants from their fields. On Sundays, families walked muddy paths in worn shoes, children clutching their mothers' skirts as fathers carried tools of work or baskets of offerings. They stepped inside the cool stone nave, the air heavy with incense and candle smoke. The Latin words of the priest echoed off the walls, unintelligible to most, yet stirring deep reverence. This was the rhythm of life: baptism, marriage, confession, burial, all marked beneath the shadow of that church tower. Imagine a family gathered in their smoky one-room cottage. Dawn has barely broken, but the father shakes the children awake and tells them it is time for Mass. The mother bundles the youngest in a rough woolen blanket, pressing him close as they trudge through damp earth toward the church. The bell tolls, and they join their neighbours on wooden benches, kneeling, crossing themselves, their faces lit by the faint glow of candles. They may not understand the sacred words, but they understand the weight. This is holy, this is necessary. Religion did not live only within the church walls, it stretched across the calendar itself. Holy days punctuated the long months of labour, from Christmas feasts to Lenten fasts. Such days gave more than spiritual meaning. They gave respite from toil. On feast days, the village sang, danced, and ate together, joy spilling out of narrow cottages into fields and lanes. On fasting days, hunger was endured with the belief that sacrifice would bring grace. The peasants' lives moved in step with the saints' days, the church bells, the cycles of fast and feast. Peasant faith was rarely simple or pure in form. Alongside the rituals of the church lived older traditions, belief in charms, relics, blessings and omens. A mother might whisper a prayer to the Virgin Mary while tying a sprig of herbs above her door to ward off evil spirits. A shepherd crossing the fields might mutter the Lord's Prayer while also carrying a small talisman in his pocket. The lines between sacred faith and superstition blurred, but to the peasants it was all the same. Protection in a world full of uncertainty where disease, famine and storms could destroy everything. Picture a mother tying a charm around her son's neck before he goes out to the fields. She murmurs a rhyme taught by her grandmother, then crosses herself quickly. To her, the charm and the prayer flow together, equal threads in the same fabric of protection. For her family, faith was not divided into categories, it was survival. But faith carried weighty obligations. Each family owed the tithe, 1/10 of their harvest, their livestock, or their earnings, given to the church. For households already living on the edge of hunger, this burden was heavy, yet refusal was unthinkable. The tithe was as certain as the Lord's taxes or the rhythm of the seasons. The church blessed births and marriages, it buried the dead, it offered alms to the poorest, but it also reminded peasants, week after week, of their debt to God and his earthly servants. Religion was both collective and deeply personal. Neighbours stood side by side in the parish mass, but each family also prayed within their own cottage. A wooden cross might hang above the hearth, its surface blackened by smoke. Perhaps a tiny painted image of a saint rested on a shelf, or a string of beads was passed between hands in whispered devotion. At night, by the faint glow of embers, parents taught children prayers. The children repeated them, not always understanding, but learning that words and gestures bound them to something far greater than themselves. Death, always close, gave religion its sharpest edge. Life expectancy was short, and sickness could sweep through a village without warning. In childbirth, at harvest, during winters of hunger, peasants knew how fragile life was. But belief gave them hope. A good death, with confession and the priest's blessing, promised heaven. A bad death, sudden and unprepared, carried the dread of damnation. Funerals were times of grief, yes, but also of certainty. The priest's prayers would guide the soul forward, and the living would continue to pray for their loved one's salvation. Imagine a winter night when sickness grips the cottage. The family gathers close, voices hushed, while the priest is fetched from the village. He arrives, cloak dusted with snow, and leans by the bedside to murmur last rites. The fire flickers, shadows dancing on tear-streaked faces. The family prays together, believing that even in loss, God's hand is present. Such was the rhythm of death and faith intertwined. Faith was resilience as much as ritual. In drought, they prayed for rain. In storms, they prayed for calm. When manorial dews pressed too heavily, when hunger hollowed their bellies, they poured out their suffering to God. For peasants, belief was not abstract. It gave meaning to hardship, teaching that this life was a passage toward something eternal. Their cottages were smoky, their fields uncertain, their lives brief, but within them burned a vision of heaven where no hunger or sorrow remained. To speak of medieval peasants is to speak of faith woven into every breath. Their religion was both burden and blessing, a tithe to pay, rituals to observe, but also comfort, hope, and the strength to endure. In their bells and prayers, their charms and festivals, their whispered songs by the hearth, they shaped a world where faith carried them through toil and tragedy alike. Their cottages may have been humble, but their beliefs stretched beyond the walls of earth and thatch toward eternity itself. And for all their labour, they were never truly free. Their place in the great chain of feudal society bound them to lords, to taxes, and to the burdens of duty that shaped every moment of their lives. For the medieval peasant family, social status and obligations were as deeply rooted in their lives as the soil they tilled. A man or woman might be born into poverty and labour, but they were not born without a place in the social order. From the humblest cotter to the more fortunate villein with strips of land, each peasant was bound by ties of obligation that defined who they were, what they owed, and how they lived. To understand their lives, one must step into the village and listen to the murmur of voices carried on the wind, each one shaped by custom and duty. Imagine a family seated on rough wooden benches inside their smoky cottage. The father's hands are cracked from work, the mother's dress patched with care, and the children's eyes bright with curiosity. They know their place without question. Their lord owns the land, the manor court enforces its rules, and the church shapes their souls. It is not asked whether they are free to choose another path. The answer is already known. Their status is inherited, passed from father to son, mother to daughter, as immovable as the walls of the church in the village square. There were different layers even within the peasantry. Some peasants, known as free tenants, paid rent in coin or produce, but had more independence. They could sometimes move from one manor to another if opportunity arose. Yet the majority were villeins, tied to the soil, bound by obligations that went beyond their own fields. They owed labour to the lord's domain, they paid dues in kind, and they attended the manor court to answer for disputes or transgressions. At the very bottom were the cotters and landless labourers, who survived on odd tasks and the goodwill of neighbours. Even among peasants there was a hierarchy, and each knew where they stood. The obligations were not abstract, they were lived realities. A villein might be called to plough the lord's land just when his own crops needed tending. He might be compelled to bring chickens, honey, or a share of his grain as rent. Even marriage was not entirely his own choice. A daughter who wished to wed outside the manor might require her lord's consent and a payment to secure it. Such customs might appear suffocating, but to the medieval peasant they were part of the order of the world. The barriers were known, and life was built around them. I can see a young girl, her hair covered by a simple kerchief, glancing nervously at her father as she whispers of a boy from another village she longs to marry. Her father sighs, knowing the request must pass through the lord's officials, and the family must give a portion of their goods to secure the union. In that moment, love becomes intertwined with obligation, the personal bound to the social order, as it always was for the peasantry. Religion, too, shaped their status. The Church taught that the social order was God's design, kings above lords, lords above peasants, fathers above children. To resist was to sin. Peasants filled the churches, their prayers mingling with the smoke of candles, their coins dropped into alms chests, even when their own families lacked bread. The priest preached patience, humility, and obedience, reinforcing a hierarchy that seemed as natural as the turning seasons. And yet the Church also offered comfort, forgiveness, the hope of salvation, and holy days that lifted the weight of labour, if only for a while. At the heart of obligations was the manor court, where disputes were heard and customs enforced. A peasant who let his animals stray into a neighbour's field, or who failed to perform his required labour, would be fined. These courts bound the community together, making the obligations visible and enforceable. Attendance itself was a duty, for each family had to witness the rulings, learning through the misfortunes of others what rules they too must follow. For peasants, law was not distant parchment, but a voice in the hall reminding them of their place. Picture the scene, a small timber hall where peasants gather, the Lord's steward seated at a wooden table, parchment rolls before him. Neighbours murmur as cases are read aloud. A man is fined for failing to repair a hedge, another for brewing ale without licence, a woman chastised for refusing the labour service owed. Children watch wide-eyed, learning the seriousness of rules long before they can fully grasp their weight. In that hall, social status is not theory. It is experienced, it is lived. Even with these burdens, the obligations also offered a measure of security. A peasant might grumble at the rent, but he also knew the Lord protected the manor from raiders and maintained order in the courts. The obligations gave structure, anchoring lives in a predictable rhythm, even if that rhythm was harsh. When famine struck, when wolves prowled at the edges of the forest, when neighbouring lords waged war, it was the community of the manor and the obligations of all that gave a sense of belonging. In that belonging, peasants found strength. Festivals and holy days, too, reflected social status. Peasants celebrated the feast of their patron saint or harvest festivals with dancing, games, and shared meals. Yet even in joy, obligations appeared, for portions of the harvest were owed to the Church or the Lord before a family could feast on their own bounty. Social rank was ever present, a shadow in both hardship and celebration. I imagine the joy of midsummer, villagers circling a fire, singing and dancing under the twilight sky, the air warm with laughter and music. Children dart between the dancers, women clap in rhythm, and men raise mugs of ale. Yet on the edge of the crowd, the steward watches, ensuring that dues are paid, that no one forgets their place. Even in the glow of celebration, obligations remain a silent guest. Over time, some peasants challenged or negotiated their obligations. A prosperous family might purchase freedoms, paying money instead of labour. Others might move to towns, seeking escape from the rigid ties of the manor. Yet for the vast majority, obligations remained their inheritance, inescapable as the seasons. Their social status was fixed, their obligations expected, their lives defined by a balance between toil, duty, and survival. And so, the medieval peasant family lived within a web of status and obligations that was both confining and sustaining. Their identity was shaped not by dreams of rising beyond their station, but by the daily reality of fulfilling what was required of them. They may not have written chronicles, but their lives wrote the quiet story of persistence. Bound by duty, grounded in faith, and tied to the land, they endured. The peasants' world was one of limits, but also of community. Their social status might have kept them humble, but it also connected them to a shared fate, woven together like the strips of land in the open fields. In their obligations lay both burden and belonging, and in that paradox the true life of the medieval peasant was lived. Yet within those heavy obligations, the family and village became their refuge. It was in the bonds of kin and neighbour that peasants found strength to endure. For medieval peasant families, life was not lived in isolation but deeply bound within the threads of kinship and community. The household was the centre of daily existence, yet it was always connected to the wider village. Family and community defined identity, purpose, and survival. To understand the life of a peasant, one must look not only at the cottage where a family ate and slept, but also at the shared fields, the village green, and the relationships that tied them all together. A family was the base of survival, but it was never an individual struggle. The father, mother, and children worked together as a unit, and beyond them extended kin, grandparents, cousins, aunts, and uncles who all played roles in daily life. The bonds of kinship were strong, for they provided not only practical help, but also emotional support in times of scarcity and hardship. Marriage was not only a union of two individuals, but often an alliance between families, strengthening networks of cooperation in tea. Imagine a cottage at dusk. Smoke rises from the thatched roof as a mother stirs a pot of pottage. The father returns from the fields with dirt on his hands, and children chase each other around the hearth. The room is crowded, but there is warmth, laughter, and familiarity. In that cramped space, family life unfolds, with its mixture of hardship and joy. The community outside those walls was equally important. Villages were built on cooperation, with peasants relying on one another for survival. In times of harvest, families shared labour, lending tools, and offering food to neighbours in need. In times of grief, such as illness or death, the village came together, offering comfort and assistance. This sense of mutual responsibility was not merely kindness, it was necessity in a world where isolation could mean ruin. The open field system was one of the most visible signs of this shared life. Strips of land were divided among families, scattered across the fields so that no single family bore the risk of poor soil or bad luck. This arrangement forced neighbours to work side by side, ploughing, sowing, and harvesting in rhythm with one another. Cooperation was not optional, it was essential. A family who refused to uphold their share of obligations might quickly find themselves isolated, a dangerous fate in a world where I see the harvest season, with women bent low gathering grain, men binding sheaves, and children chasing after stray stalks. Voices carry across the fields laughter, songs, and calls of encouragement. Though each family reaps for their own household, the atmosphere is communal. At the end of the day, weary labourers share bread and ale, their tiredness softened by companionship. Festivals and holy days brought the entire community together. The churchyard filled with villagers on feast days, where work gave way to celebration. Music, dancing and feasting reinforced the bonds between neighbours. These events reminded peasants that they were part of something greater than themselves, tied to each other through both faith and daily struggle. Family roles were shaped by necessity rather than choice. Fathers were expected to provide physical labour and uphold obligations to the Lord, while mothers managed the household, prepared food, and raised children. Yet the lines blurred, as women often joined men in the fields during busy seasons, and men cared for animals or repaired homes when needed. Children contributed as soon as they were able, tending geese, fetching water, or scaring birds from crops. The family was not just a biological unit, but picture a winter's evening. The fields lie fallow, snow covers the ground, and within the cottage the family sits close to the fire. The mother spins wool while telling stories, the father repairs tools, and the children listen wide-eyed to tales of saints and local legends. Outside, neighbours gather at one another's homes, sharing food and companionship during the long cold nights. This closeness fostered bonds not only between kin, but also among the wider community, binding people together through obligations to the community extended beyond farming. Families were expected to attend the manor court, contribute to communal projects like road repair, and provide assistance to neighbours in times of crisis. A sick or injured farmer could count on neighbours to help tend his fields, for the community understood that survival depended on reciprocity. This mutual reliance created a sense of shared fate, where one family's misfortune threatened the well-being of the whole village. Religious life further deepened this sense of community. The parish church was not only a spiritual centre, but also a social one. Baptisms, marriages, and funerals marked the rhythm of communal life, drawing villagers together to share in each other's milestones. Faith was a collective experience, binding families through rituals, prayers, and the hope of divine protection. Imagine the Easter celebration in a small village. Families gather in the churchyard, children clutching flowers, women in their best woolen dresses, men sharing mugs of ale. The air is filled with music and laughter, yet beneath it is a shared sense of belonging, a recognition that they are bound together not only by faith, but also by the land and their daily struggles. These rituals were more than tradition, they were anchors of community identity. Family and community also acted as safety nets. When famine threatened, neighbours shared what little food they had. When fire struck a cottage, others helped rebuild. This network of mutual aid created resilience in the face of adversity. It also provided a sense of meaning. Peasants knew they were not alone, that their struggles were understood and shared. Of course, tensions existed. Disputes over land boundaries, unpaid debts, or insults could spark arguments that disrupted village harmony. Yet even conflicts were mediated within the structures of community, whether in the manor court or through local customs. Isolation was a punishment, and reconciliation was valued. Harmony, even if fragile, was necessary for survival. Over generations, these ties of family and community created continuity. Children grew into adults who inherited both the land and the responsibilities of their parents. Stories, traditions, and values were passed down, binding each generation to the last. The village was not simply a place to live, it was an interwoven tapestry of lives that defined one another. The life of the medieval peasant family was not one of solitude but of belonging. The walls of the cottage sheltered them from the cold, but it was the bonds of kinship and community that truly sustained them. Their world was one of cooperation, of shared burdens and shared joys, of survival woven together by countless acts of labour, faith and fellowship. To walk through a medieval village was to see this truth in motion. Families clustered by their hearths, neighbours working side by side in the fields, voices rising together in church or festival, and children growing up surrounded by both kin and community. In this web of relationships, peasants found strength, identity, and endurance, making family and community the true heart of their world. And though they owned little, the few clothes on their backs and the simple tools in their homes told stories of survival, identity, and belonging. For medieval peasant families, clothing and possessions were the small, stubborn facts of daily life, tangible proofs of labour, thrift, and kinship. Garments and household goods were few, but each piece was saturated with meaning and use. A tunic was not only a layer against the wind, it was months of spinning, carding, and weaving, and then years of wear, patching, and repurposing. A wooden chest was not mere furniture, it was a family archive that guarded scraps of cloth, a clasp knife, a tiny hoard of coins, and a wedding token that tethered the living to the memory of those who had come before. Most clothing began in the cottage itself, or very close to it. Linen grew from flax pulled in summer, dried, rippled, retted, scutched, and hackled into spinnable fibre. Wool came from sheep on common pasture, their fleeces sheared and washed before the clatter of carders teased fibres into order. Women spun by the hearth, a low rhythm that matched the stir of pottage and the chatter of children. Looms, when present, occupied precious space, yet their presence turned quiet evenings into a steady production line of thread into cloth. When cloth could be bought, it was coarse and serviceable. When it was homemade, it carried the irregularities of the maker's hand and the pride of a household's self-reliance. Colours tended toward the earth. Unbleached linen made pale shifts. Undyed wool lay in shades of cream, brown, and grey. When colour appeared, it announced effort and expense. Onion skins and weld might yield yellow, madder, tended like a secret, offered rusty reds. Woad could give a stubborn blue, though the preparations stung the nose and soaked time. Brightness faded in sun and soap, but the ghost of colour in a festival hood or a Sunday ribbon still caught the eye and reminded the wearer that celebration had a place in even the leanest year. Men wore knee-length tunics, belted at the waist, brays beneath, and hose tied to points. In cold months, a cloak or hood turned the wind and shed rain. Women layered long gowns of wool over linen shifts, fixed with girdles that held knife and keys. Aprons guarded skirts from mud and fire, and head coverings kept smoke out of hair and lent a quiet dignity that custom approved. Footwear, when it existed, was plain leather turned shoes with thin soles. More than one winter was met with rags wrapped around feet, or with wooden pattens that lifted soles above muck in the yard. Clothes moved through a long life cycle. A new tunic made for a father at Michaelmas might, some years later, be cut down for a growing son. Worn elbows were darned with cross-hatching, knees were patched with darker squares that told their own story, and torn hems learned the language of blanket stitch. When a garment surrendered at last, it was not thrown away. It became lining, then dishcloth, then rag for polishing metal or binding a blistered heel. Waste was a luxury peasants could not afford, and thrift was an art practised daily without sermon or boast. Laundry day revealed the chemistry of survival. Linen could be scoured with lye leached from wood ash. Wool demanded cooler water, gentle hands, and patience. On a clear morning, shirts and shifts spread like sails across hedges and bushes. The scent of soapwort and smoke drifted along the lane, and neighbours traded tips and teasing as they slapped cloth against boards. The work was heavy, but the result was a dignity worth the effort. Clean garments that warmed skin and calmed the mind. Possessions inside the cottage were few and purposeful. A trestle table could be taken down to make space for sleeping pallets. Stools, benches, and a settle clustered around the hearth where all true living happened. Pots of clay, an iron cauldron if fortune smiled, a pan for bread on baking days, a ladle carved from ash, and a handful of bowls made up most kitchens. A whetstone, a mallet, a small axe, and a knife formed a toolkit that travelled between field and home. Each object earned its keep, and each breakage was a minor crisis solved with ingenuity or the favour of a neighbour's loan. There was almost always a chest, thick, boarded and iron-strapped if the family could manage it. Inside, savings jingled faintly in a cloth purse. A folded scrap of parchment might preserve a debt or a boundary agreement. A pair of better cuffs waited for feast days. Some families kept a rosary of wooden beads worn smooth by fingers, a pilgrim badge from a distant shrine, or a wax tablet for marking accounts. The chest's smell of wool, beeswax, and old smoke was the intimate scent of continuity, the household's memory made material. I picture a winter evening when the door pushes open and a boy stumbles in, cheeks stung red by the wind. His mother lifts a cloak from its peg and wraps it around him, the same cloak that warmed his father on frosty dawns and once covered his grandmother's shoulders. She checks the mended seam at the shoulder, nods to herself, and smiles. The boy runs his hand along the nap of the cloth, feeling the faint ridge where a patch lies hidden, and discovers that love and labour can be stitched into a single garment. Even the smallest adornments mattered. A brass brooch to fasten a cloak could be the proudest object a woman owned, handed down with a whispered story of who wore it at what wedding. A bit of coloured braid on a child's cap could transform a gloomy Sunday into a bright one. Sumptuary customs, and sometimes laws, pressed the poor to remain visibly poor, forbidding certain furs or fabrics and mirroring the broader social order in the quiet theatre of cloth. Yet peasants still found ways to signal care and taste within narrow means, choosing a neat seam, a clean collar, and a dash of colour that respected custom while honouring self-taught respect. Market days and fairs were the hinge between household production and the larger world. A woman might bring spun yarn, eggs, or a skein of dyed thread to trade for a second-hand cloak or a length of canvas. A pedlar's pack, unfolded like a travelling cupboard, spilled needles, pins, laces, and ribbons that made eyes widen and purses groan. Tools changed hands there too. A scythe blade traded for 2 hens, a repair to a broken pot paid in onions, and a promise. In these exchanges, possessions circulated as stories as well as objects, carrying the warmth of voices and the reckoning of debts settled fairly. Children learned the grammar of things early. A boy's first knife, blunt and cherished, marked a small border crossed into usefulness. A girl's first spindle, dropped more than it spun at first, opened a door to the family's economy of cloth. Toys were rare and often carved at home. A wooden horse from a branch knot, a hoop from a broken barrel stave. Because possessions were scarce, they were noticed, and because they were noticed, they taught memory and care. A child who kept a ribbon safe earned trust for larger tasks and kept later promises better. I see a wedding morning when a bride opens the family chest with her mother. Out come the few bright pieces saved for this day, a gown taken in at the waist, a veil borrowed from a cousin, a girdle with a little brass buckle polished to a soft shine. Her dowry is modest, a blanket, a pan, and a pair of sheets of good linen that took 2 winters to weave. Yet as neighbours crowd the doorway, the cottage seems rich with laughter, and the bride glows with the knowledge that each object is a thread in a net of generosity that will hold her in the years to come. Hard years carved their signatures into things. A poor harvest meant more patches and fewer shoes. A fire could steal the sum of a household's labour in an hour, sending families to neighbours for spare blankets and a loaned pot until a new roof stood. In plague years, a chest might pass from hand to hand too quickly, turning keepsakes into painful reminders. Yet recovery began with the same practical acts: carding wool, mending hems, carving pegs, rewatched seasoning a salvaged pan. Possessions were not only ends to desire, they were tools for rebuilding dignity after loss. Faith occupied a corner of the chest and of the mind. A small cross above the hearth, a page from a torn psalter kept for its painted letter, a candle stub saved for the blessing of throats in winter, set a sacred rhythm against the roughness of work. Clothing and possessions entered that rhythm on feast days. when better garments emerged from storage and the good cup went round the table. The line between sacred and ordinary crossed at the seam of a sleeve and the rim of a bowl, reminding the family that holiness could rest in careful use. At day's end, when the last embers collapsed into a glow, garments were hung to dry, shoes set to the side, and tools leaned neatly against the wall. The cottage, stripped to quiet shapes in the firelight, became a catalogue of humble abundance, the pan that made soup, the cloak that carried a father across the fields, the spindle that promised next winter's yarn. To outside eyes, the room might have looked bare. To those who lived there, it was sufficiency earned by steady hands and kept by steady hearts. Clothing and possessions did not simply reflect poverty, they encoded resilience and craft. In a world of scarcity, peasants built comfort from wool and wood, honour from neat stitches and clean collars, and memory from objects tended and handed on. The fabric of their lives was not only metaphorical, it was literal cloth, thick with lanolin and smoke, thinned by years and strengthened by care. To step into a peasant cottage was to step into a museum of use, where every object was both a story and a tool, and where survival, dignity and love took the shape of things that could be held, worn, mended and shared. But life was not only toil and want. On feast days and holy days, the village came alive with laughter, music, and the joy of festivals that lit even the darkest seasons. For medieval peasant families, life was ruled by the rhythm of labour. Yet within that rhythm lay intervals of rest, joy, and festivity. Leisure and festivals did not exist in opposition to work. They were woven into the same cycle of seasons and obligations. In a world where toil was constant and survival fragile, moments of celebration carried extraordinary weight. They gave peasants opportunities to reaffirm their bonds with family and community, to mark the passing of time, and to lift spirits with music, food, and shared laughter. When the church calendar dictated a holy day, the fields grew quiet. Peasants set aside their tools, gathered their families, and made their way to the parish church. Holy days were far more than religious obligations. They were the framework of medieval leisure. Christmas, Easter, Pentecost, and the feast days of saints punctuated the year with anticipation and ritual. These festivals brought music, pageantry, and food that stood in stark contrast to the daily monotony of bread and pottage. For peasants, the promise of a feast day meant more than spiritual renewal. It meant relief from routine and a chance to breathe. Imagine the village on a feast day morning. The bells toll and smoke curls from chimneys as women prepare bread, pies and ale. Children, scrubbed clean and dressed in their best tunics, chase each other down the lane. Men gather, greeting one another with laughter and claps on the shoulder. The entire community converges toward the churchyard, their ordinary routines suspended by the solemnity and joy of the occasion. After prayers and sermons, the real celebration begins, spilling into games, feasts, and dancing that linger long into the evening. Leisure was often communal rather than solitary. Sports like wrestling, football, and archery brought villagers together in fields and greens. Wrestling matches tested strength and courage, drawing crowds that shouted encouragement and friendly taunts. Medieval football, far rougher than today's game, spilled across meadows and sometimes through the streets, with entire groups chasing a ball of leather stuffed with rags. These games could be chaotic, but they gave peasants a sense of release and unity, the excitement of competition mingled with the relief of play. Music and dance were also at the heart of peasant leisure. Minstrels or local musicians played fiddles, pipes and drums, setting the rhythm for circle dances and lively reels. Evenings after a long harvest might end with singing around a fire, voices mingling as neighbours shared ale and stories. Dance was not reserved for the wealthy. It was a universal language of joy, giving the poorest families a chance to laugh and move together after days of unrelenting labour. Picture a summer evening on the village green. The glow of torches flickers as villagers join hands in a circle. Fiddles scrape out a tune, and bare feet pound the earth in time. Children clap along, women spin with skirts flying, men stomp with grins, splitting their tired faces. For a few hours, hunger and hardship recede, replaced by music and movement that remind everyone that life contained more than struggle. Storytelling was another form of leisure that carried both entertainment and education. By the hearth in winter, elders recounted tales of saints, of Arthurian knights, of foxes outwitting hunters. These stories wove moral lessons with humour and wonder, reminding children of courage and cunning while strengthening bonds across ages. Leisure, even in its simplest forms, reinforced the continuity of peasant life and connected families to shared traditions. Festivals were also tied to the agricultural cycle. Harvest celebrations were among the most significant, marking the completion of the most grueling season of the year. A good harvest meant tables piled high with bread, cheese and ale, with roasted meats shared among neighbours. A poor harvest lent a note of anxiety to the celebration, but still the festival mattered. To gather, to feast, to thank God and neighbours alike was essential to morale. These occasions were not simply diversions, they were survival strategies, maintaining communal spirit through hardship. I see the harvest home in full swing. Long tables of rough boards are laden with bread, cheese, roasted meats, and pitchers of ale. Villagers raise mugs, toasting the end of toil. A fiddler plays a lively jig as children dance between benches, their laughter ringing out. Laughter rises into the autumn night, and for once bellies are full and hearts are light. The festival becomes a memory that carries families through the winter to come. Leisure and festivals also held a subtle politics. By granting holy days and feast times, lords and the church both maintained goodwill and reinforced authority. Rest was permitted, but on terms dictated by higher powers. Still, peasants claimed these spaces as their own, finding joy and autonomy in the midst of rules and hierarchy. Even in their games, songs and feasts, peasants carved out brief territories of freedom, moments where hierarchy blurred and the common humanity of work, laughter and play took centre stage. Not all leisure was grand or communal. Small pleasures brightened daily life. a mother humming while she spun wool, a boy carving a toy from scrap wood, a group of girls picking flowers along a hedgerow. All of these quiet acts counted as leisure. The importance lay not in the scale, but in the respite. A few minutes of peace or laughter could mean the difference between despair and resilience. Even in the harshest conditions, peasants sought joy, reminding us that humanity is not only defined by work, but by the will to play and rest. Religious festivals often mingled the sacred with the secular. On feast days, miracle plays might be performed in the churchyard, villagers acting out biblical stories with humour and exaggeration. These plays reinforced faith, but also delighted audiences, allowing laughter and devotion to coexist. The mingling of solemn prayer with cheerful festivity captures the essence of medieval life. Faith and joy were not opposites, but intertwined realities, sustaining peasants in both spirit and body. At the close of the year, Christmas stood as a festival that embodied both hardship and hope. Even in the poorest cottages, greenery was brought inside, carols were sung, and neighbours exchanged small gifts of food or drink. The coldest nights of the year were softened by light, music, and companionship. These celebrations reminded peasants that life was more than survival. It was also about marking time, sharing joy, and affirming community. Leisure and festivals were not luxuries in the medieval peasant world. They were essential counterweights to labour, lifelines of hope, and expressions of identity. They gave peasants the strength to endure another day in the fields, another winter of scarcity, another year of obligations to Lord and Church. In their laughter, their dances, their shared bread and stories, peasants found resilience and belonging. The image of medieval peasants, as people crushed entirely by hardship, overlooks these crucial dimensions of life. Their songs, their games, their feast days and their dances were acts of endurance as much as pleasure. They reveal a truth. Even in the hardest ages, joy insists on a place. For medieval peasant families, leisure and festivals were not an escape from life, but a vital part of it, stitched into the same fabric as toil and faith, hunger and hope. In their celebrations, they affirmed that life was worth the struggle, and in their moments of laughter, they discovered freedom, however brief, within the weight of obligation. And yet, beyond the dancing and song, hardship always waited. Hunger, illness, and death walked hand in hand with the people of the Middle Ages. For medieval peasant families, life was an endless negotiation with hardship. Every season carried risks, and health was never secure. Hunger, disease, injury, and exhaustion shaped their existence as much as the soil they ploughed or the livestock they tended. In the absence of modern medicine and safety nets, survival itself was a daily struggle, where resilience became both necessity and virtue. Hardship began with the land. A poor harvest meant hunger, and hunger was a constant shadow. Peasants lived on bread, pottage, and what vegetables or scraps they could gather, but bad weather or blight could wipe out a year's effort. Famine struck in waves across medieval Europe, and the poor bore the brunt. Malnutrition weakened bodies, leaving them vulnerable to disease. A child who survived infancy often did so by chance and sheer endurance, for mortality rates were brutally high. Picture a cottage in late winter, food stores nearly gone. The bread is thinner, stretched with ground acorns, and the pot on the fire is half empty. A mother stirs slowly, dividing portions between hungry children while her own stomach aches. The father rises for work, though his body is weakened by cold and want. This was not an unusual scene, but a common reality, hardship measured not in dramatic calamity, but in the slow erosion of strength across endless seasons. Health was fragile. Injuries in the fields were frequent. A slip of the sickle, a fall while guiding the plough, a wound from handling animals. Even small cuts could fester, turning lethal without proper treatment. Childbirth was perilous, and many women died bringing new life into the world. Disease swept through villages with little resistance, dysentery from contaminated water, fevers carried by lice, and, in the 14th century, the horror of the Black Death. To be a peasant was to live with the constant presence of illness. Medical care, when available, came from local healers, wise women or priests. Herbs, poultices, charms and prayers formed the toolkit of medieval medicine for the poor. A poultice of honey might soothe a wound, garlic might be given for worms, and a cross traced on the body might serve to ward off evil spirits thought to cause illness. While monasteries preserved medical knowledge, peasants rarely had access to such resources. Their health care was communal and improvised, rooted in experience and tradition more than science. I imagine an elderly woman in the village who knows the uses of plants. She gathers yarrow, nettles and comfrey, hanging them to dry in her smoky cottage. When neighbours fall ill, she visits with remedies and advice, offering not certainty but comfort. Her knowledge is respected, her presence a reassurance in a world with few answers. For peasants, health was bound to trust in such figures and the fragile hope that remedies and prayer might be enough. The greatest hardship of all was plague. When the Black Death struck in the mid-14th century, villages emptied and families were torn apart. Entire households vanished within weeks, their possessions abandoned, their fields left untended. Survivors lived with grief and fear, watching neighbours carried away on carts to hastily dug graves. This devastation left scars that lasted generations, deepening peasants' sense of life as precarious and unpredictable. Even without plague, everyday life wore down the body. Work began before dawn and ended only with dusk, leaving little time for recovery. Backs bent, joints stiffened, and muscles ached with constant strain. Few peasants lived long by modern standards. Reaching old age was rare, and those who did often bore the marks of hardship in crooked spines, missing teeth, and weathered faces. Children were precious not only as heirs but as labourers, essential to the family's survival, yet they too carried the burden of fatigue and disease. Community provided the closest thing to support. Neighbours helped in times of illness or injury, bringing food, tending animals, or assisting with harvest. The church played a role too, offering charity, prayers, and the promise of eternal life as consolation against earthly suffering. Festivals and holy days gave moments of respite, when hardship was set aside and health celebrated through feasting, dancing, and communal joy. These pauses mattered, for they reminded peasants that life was more than suffering. I see a family in springtime, weakened by a hard winter, but drawn together by Easter celebrations. They enter the church, candles flickering, and for a moment the father forgets the ache in his body, the mother her constant hunger. The children's eyes are bright as they sing. This was part of health too, the restoration of spirit, the resilience that comes from joy as much as from food or medicine. Hardship also fostered wisdom. Peasants understood the cycles of sickness, the importance of rest when possible, and the dangers of overexertion. They valued cleanliness within limits, sweeping cottages, airing bedding, and keeping animals in separate spaces when they could. They did not think of health in modern scientific terms, but they knew well that filth bred illness and that exhaustion broke the body. Their practices were shaped by trial, error, and the collective memory of what had kept previous generations alive. Injuries and illness reminded peasants constantly of mortality, but they also strengthened community bonds. A neighbour who survived a fever owed gratitude to those who brought broth to their door. A family who lost a child leaned on the comfort of others who had known the same grief. Hardship shared became hardship lessened, if not healed, and this sharing was as vital to survival as bread or water. Still, the fragility of health marked every decision. Marriages were often made young, for parents knew that life was short. Children were many, to offset the reality that some would not live to adulthood. Work was constant, for rest was a luxury peasants could seldom afford. Yet in the midst of hardship there was a fierce clinging to life. Peasants laughed, sang, and loved with an intensity born of scarcity. They knew better than most how quickly health could be lost, and so they cherished moments of vitality as treasures. I imagine an old man sitting outside his cottage at dusk, his back bent, his hands twisted with arthritis. He watches the fields, listening to the laughter of children. His body is frail, but his eyes still shine. He has lived through hunger, disease, and loss. Yet he has also known love, community, and fleeting joy. In that mixture of suffering and resilience lies the truth of medieval peasant health and hardship. The story of medieval peasants cannot be told only in terms of poverty and suffering, nor only in resilience and endurance. It lies in the interplay of the two. Hardship defined their existence, yet within it, health, fragile, precious, fleeting, was pursued with every resource they had. Their lives remind us that strength is not the absence of suffering, but the will to continue in spite of it. For peasant families, hardship and health were inseparable, two sides of the same coin, shaping lives of quiet determination and endurance.